Hello, my name is Jason Spies, host of The Bakken Insider, an original series put out by Bakken Insights. Today's interview is sponsored by Head Companies of South Dakota. Recently, we sat down with Ken DeCubellis, Chief Executive Officer of Black Ridge Oil and Gas in Minot, North Dakota during the Bakken Investors Conference. And this is what Ken DeCubellis had to say. How are you doing today?
Doing excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And tell me a little bit about your company, Black Ridge Oil and Gas.
So we're Bakken focused only and a non-operator. So the way I like to tell people, everyone's hearing about the shale plays across the country, and it's we're participating in that shale revolution here domestically, but we're laser focused only on the Bakken. And the reasons for that are twofold. Number one, we love the fact that it's an oil play. 90 to 95% of the hydrocarbons that come out of the ground are oil. And then secondly, we have some strong ties to the basin. The guy that heads our land group, Mike Isley, his wife is from Williston, and so she still has family there. So it's important for us as we continue to grow the company that we have that boots on the ground capability to get new deals in, new leases to acquire to help us continue to fuel our growth.
How long has your company been incorporated, or a company? You mentioned it's specifically Bakken, so I imagine it's relatively young.
October 2010 is when we acquired our first lease in the Bakken, so that's what, two and a half years. Mm-hmm. So we're a relatively new entrant into the play.
How many locations do you guys have?
In terms of offices? Or we have one main office, which is outside of Minneapolis.
Is that relatively easy, or does that pose some difficulty being a Minneapolis company and doing business out in the Bakken?
You can fly direct from Minneapolis to Williston now. I had no problems getting a flight here to Minot. And you can actually, one of the times I came out here, I took the Amtrak out of St. Paul, get a sleeper car, you leave at 11 p.m. and you wake up the following morning in Minot. So we don't have any problems getting here. Michael is typically out here once a month. And so, we don't see any issues there. We like, a lot of our relationships on the investor side are out of Minneapolis. Our current banker is a Minneapolis-based banker, and so we don't see difficulties with our location.
Observations from the first time you set foot in the Bakken to now. What have your observations been since 2010?
It's getting crazier. There's activity is at a peak. I don't see any slowdown now. The story I like to tell is the last time I was out here in Williston in November was the time I took the train. And I had a return train leaving Williston Station at 7 p.m. Michael and I were driving around the Watford City area, in Dickinson, down in that area, the southern part of the play. We left Dickinson at around 3:30, and we could not get to Williston in time because of the traffic. And so it's a great story. He told me, Ken, don't worry. The next eastern stop for Amtrak is Stanley. We'll drive that way and get you to Stanley. And so we were south of the river, you can only cross at one point. Traffic was backed up again. We missed the Stanley pickup as well. And so, it's great though. It just speaks to how the big investors and operators are still very active here. We continue to drill a lot of wells. There's a need for infrastructure. We're seeing that investment across the board, not just to get the oil and gas out of the Bakken to the refineries, but on the simple things like expanding the roads and adding more housing and hotel space, restaurants, et cetera. It's at an all-time high.
Governor Ed Schaefer told me in an interview, former Governor Ed Schaefer, that this is a technology boom, not an oil boom. Your thoughts on that?
I completely agree. I used to work for ExxonMobil, and in the early 2000s into 2006, Exxon was worried, as was the rest of the country, that we were running out of natural gas here. They embarked on a multi-year program investing about $30 billion in the Middle East in a country called Qatar to get access to the natural gas in Qatar, liquefy it, ship it over to the U.S., regasify it out offshore and get it into the grid. $30 billion, okay? Now what Exxon is trying to do is take all the natural gas that we're producing here in this country and export it. So they're going in the opposite direction. Two drivers behind why the energy situation has flipped completely on its head in a short period of time. It's the advent of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And it's a combination of those two, which is very technology focused, that has unlocked this potential. There's a guy named Mitchell who tried this back in the 80s in the Barnett Shale down, which is below Fort Worth. And he was trying and trying for a decade or so. He finally partnered with the DOE. The DOE had some shale data that they were analyzing in Pennsylvania. They combined that data and the technology took off from there.
How long do you think the Bakken play will go on for?
There's really going to be two phases. The oil itself, once the wells are in place, will produce anywhere 25, 30, 35 years. Okay, so you'll continue to see production. I think the bigger question is, how long do we see the crazy level of investment on the drilling side? And that's really going to be moderated by the fact that out here in western North Dakota, we just don't have the access to the pipeline infrastructure needed to get the oil to the refineries. So until that investment occurs, it's really going to moderate how crazy the operators go at producing more and more oil, because they don't want to produce more than you can take away. The end of it, I think we'll see this kind of activity for about 5 to 10 years at a peak level. Then it might kind of moderate from there. But the big wild card is if they find more productive formations. Continental recently talked about a third bench of the Bakken in northern McKenzie County. I think the Three Forks layer, which hasn't been fully understood yet, which is that layer below the Bakken shale, could be very productive as well. Depending on how productive those layers are, this could continue for even longer.
You mentioned natural gas earlier. Former Public Service Commissioner Tony Clark told me that natural gas is the real wild card out here in the Bakken. Governor Jack Dalrymple sought out and found a buyer in Japan for natural gas. You mentioned Exxon, also Dow Chemicals been working on ways to capture that natural gas.
Yes.
How undervalued is natural gas? Meaning, when people think of the Bakken, oil comes to mind.
Right.
Should people be thinking more about natural gas?
Without question. And the reason is because it's not dry gas, it's wet. And so you hear people talk about NGLs, natural gas liquids. That's things like ethane, propane, butane. And you mentioned Dow Chemical. Dow wants ethane because they can turn that into ethylene, which is a precursor for polyethylene and other types of plastics and rubbers. And so the petrochemical industry itself is forecast to add about $30 billion of capacity expansion here in the U.S. to get access to that natural gas and convert it into plastics. So it's a big deal here. And today, unfortunately, we just don't have enough of the infrastructure in place to capture the gas in the Bakken and treat it and fractionate out the NGLs. But once that happens, you won't see as much flaring anymore. And that wet gas trades at a significant premium to the dry gas, and so economically it benefits everybody as well.
It's really interesting because most people will think of crude oil and the amount of natural gas. Could there be another boom based on natural gas, and does it mean technology is that important for the capture?
When you say boom here in the Bakken?
Yeah, in the Bakken, everybody thinks it's crude oil, but could there be another additional boom because of the natural gas?
Yeah, I don't know. Boom, it's still volumetrically, it's not as significant as the oil. Like I said, I think over the long term, I think many forecasts have, for every barrel you produce out of the ground, about 90% of it will be crude. But with that said, that 10% or so of NGLs is very, very economically attractive. So I wouldn't call it a boom, but the economics will improve significantly.
Any advice you might have for somebody coming to the Bakken play, whether it's a 25-year-old guy driving out there to paint his destiny with crude oil, or it's a gentleman like yourself going out there as a seasoned businessman?
I have a lot of folks come to me at various conferences that I speak to across the country. A lot of people in Minneapolis that say, I have this kind of a project, and it could be a restaurant, it could be whatever. And they say, how do I participate in this? And what I tell them is to get out there. Get out to Williston, get out to Dickinson, get out to Stanley, walk around, meet people, understand the situation, and then be willing to take the risk. Because at the end of the day, the simple solution, if you're an entrepreneur, is to not act. And by not acting, you're missing this revolution. And it's truly a revolution that's occurring now. That's why we're so excited at Blackridge to be participating in this. When people talk about us producing more oil on a daily basis in Saudi Arabia, That's the potential we have. When they talk about North America becoming an oil exporter and energy independence, we were not thinking anything like that 6 or 10 years ago. And so it's really a revolution. It's exciting to be a part of.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Today's interview was brought to you by Head Companies of South Dakota. Thank you for tuning in and watching the Bakken Insider, an original series put out by Bakken Insight. I'm your host, Jason Spiess. We'll see you next time.